Hi, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of my show, The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium. You know Wondrium, the teaching company, the great courses. They have a whole new package now. You stream through a subscription service all those great courses, college-level audio and video courses. I always do the audio because I'm usually riding my bike or driving my car or hiking with the dog or whatever. But you can also watch them. They're beautifully produced, professionally produced at a studio. So that's really cool. Quality is the best. And it's not just the great courses. They also have tutorials, how-to lessons, travel logs, documentary films, short films, and documentary series, and so on. Here's one, for example, that I took. This one's called The Skeptic's Guide to American History. How about that? Is that the perfect course for me? And it's 24 30-minute lectures. You can access this course through this podcast and get 2 years for the price of one. Not just this course, of course, hundreds and hundreds of courses through Wondrium. You go to wondrium.com/Shermer, wondrium.com/SHERMER. Like this one, for example, is an award-winning scholar and professor examines commonly held myths and half-truths about American history and invites you to think about what really happened in the nation's past. I was amazed. I know a lot of history, and I was amazed at how much I didn't know and how many myths I was still holding. Did slavery really cause the Civil War? The Civil War's actual turning points? The myth of laissez-faire? Hey, what? Oh, yeah, there's a lot of myths about that. Misconceptions about the original populists. The Roaring Twenties, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt, World War II misconceptions and myths. Really? Yeah, there's a lot. Real blunders of the Vietnam War. That one was interesting, and so on. Anyway, so history did not begin with us is the last lecture. I love that. Anyway, check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer. Get 2 years for the price of one. It's a great streaming service. They just streams it straight into your phone, right into your ears, and you can take all this endless content. Why would you ever drive around not listening to something to learn? Learning is a lifelong experience. It doesn't end in college. I'm 68 and I'm still learning new stuff pretty much every day. It's amazing. So check it out, wondrium.com/Shermer. 2 years for the price of one. Why would you not do that? Don't listen to my podcast until you go to wondrium.com/Shermer and then come back to us. All right. Thanks for listening. Just to remind you, I'm the publisher of this Skeptic Magazine. This is an appropriate issue, our latest issue. Oh, no, that's the one on race. Hang on. Here's our latest one on nationalism. Appropriate for our guest today, who's a political scientist. The rise of Christian nationalism and all kinds of economic nationalism and the neuroscience of political polarization and election fraud critically examined, the origins of nationalism, and so on. If you want to subscribe to Skeptic Magazine, you can get it in print at any fine bookstore, or you can order it from our office right here where I'm sitting, and we'll mail it to you, or you can go to skeptic.com and just order it digitally and read it on your smartphone or your iPad or whatever. And if you support the society and our work and this podcast and so on, you can go to skeptic.com/donate and give us a little support there. Very much appreciate that. Okay, my guest today is Timothy Redmond, who received his PhD in political science from the University of Buffalo. He is an award-winning educator and author of over 100 articles on critical thinking and politics, including in Skeptic. And he's a professor at Damon University, where he teaches political science and history, a political science and history course for education students. So it's very wide-ranging on a number of these topics we're going to address today. Timothy, nice to see you, and congratulations on the book. This is the new book here. I forgot to introduce that. Political Tribalism in America, How Hyper-Partisanship Dumbs Down Democracy and How to Fix It. Red, white, and blue. There it is. You are all-American, flag-waving patriot.
Hi, Michael. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, what great timing for your book. Wow. I mean, we're kind of in the thick of it. So let's start there. How do you know it's really more polarizing now than it was decades ago or a century ago, whatever? You know, I'm thinking like I graduated high school 72, started college that fall, right in the middle of Watergate and Nixon and all the craziness and it seemed polarizing then. Do we know it's really more polarizing now, or is this the availability heuristic and the recency effect and all that?
Yeah, a lot of it is the availability heuristic. I think the challenge is there's different kinds, political scientists, when they look at polarization, there's different kinds of polarization. And in general, when people hear the term polarization, I think they think policy polarization. And that's the idea that Democrats are moving further to the left on the issues, Republicans are moving further to the right on the issues, and therefore we're becoming more polarized. And there is a debate in political science about this. I tend to side with the political scientists who say that's not really happening, that we haven't really separated on the issues per se. And I think part of that is the availability heuristic. When the media talks about this a lot, if you just, if you Google political polarization, you'll get hundreds and hundreds and thousands of articles. And I think also part of it is our experiences on social media. And so if we're on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, we tend to be exposed to the most extreme voices. And so if you just go on there casually, it really seems like we're highly polarized. But in fact, it's more that and it's a little bit complicated to explain, but it's more that the parties themselves, like the average party position, has polarized. But that has happened without anyone changing their issue positions. And the way that, I guess, if you can think of like a continuum, say you have a scale of 0 to 10, and 0 is the most liberal you could possibly be on a position, and 10 is the most conservative you could be on a position. We used to have liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, but we also used to have, conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. So if you had, imagine that scale of 0 to 10, and just take, to keep it simple, like four voters or something like that. And at the 0 end of the scale, you have that person takes the most liberal position that you possibly could, the 0. And then on the right side of the scale, you have a conservative Republican who takes the most conservative position at a 10. And then you could have, say, a liberal Republican, right, who's sort of on the liberal side of the scale, but it's more moderate, so they might put themselves at a 4. And then you can have a conservative Democrat who's on the conservative side of the scale, but say they're at like a 6. Well, then if you just looked at the average, like, say, Democratic position, you're taking a 0 and you're taking a 6, divide it by 2, and your average Democratic position is a 3, right? And then you look at the Republicans, and you've got one Republican, the conservative Republican with a 10, and you've got the liberal Republican with a 4. Add those together, divide by 2, you have a 7. So like the average liberal position, the average Democratic position is a 3, the average Republican position is a 7. What's happened is people haven't changed their issue positions, but if that liberal Republican becomes a liberal Democrat, and they still identify as a 4, but they just switch their party, and that conservative Democrat who identified as a 6, now they just become a conservative Republican. Well, now your average Republican scores, it's 10 and 6, divide that by 2, now all of a sudden it's an 8, so you've gone from a 7 to an 8. Right, it's polarized, but no one has changed their issue position, and it's the same for.
So interesting.
Yeah, and it's the same, in this example, if for the Democrats, you've got now, instead of a 3 average score to be a 2, and so the parties themselves are moving apart, but people necessarily aren't. And then the other thing I think that is at play here is, when you look at some real survey data on issue positions, a lot of Americans hold moderate views. And I wouldn't say necessarily agree, but they're a lot closer than we tend to think. There's this big perception gap. And there's there's actually a website called The Perception Gap, where they look at this and they ask Democrats and Republicans, what are your views on a host of issues? And then they ask, what do you think? They ask Democrats, what do you think the average Republican position is on this? And they ask Republican, what do you think the average Democratic position on this? And we way overestimate how extreme members of the other party are. So I think, I mean, there's a long answer to your question, but I think we're less polarized on issues than we might think.
Interesting.
That doesn't mean we don't, but there is also something called affective polarization. And this is how members of the parties feel about each other. And that has grown. And so if you go back to like the 1970s, and this was, political scientists would do this on a thermometer scale. So they would ask you like 0 to 100 degrees. How do you feel about members of your party? How do you feel about members of the other party? And so like a neutral score would be 50 degrees. And generally, Democrats and Republicans, if you ask a Democrat, how do you feel about Democrats? They would say about 70 degrees. If you ask Republicans how they feel about Republicans, they would say about 70 degrees. But and then when you ask them about members of the other party, they both said like around 50 degrees, which was pretty neutral. So that was back in the 70s. Now, partisanship, or the affection you feel for your own party, hasn't really changed. That stayed around 70 degrees. But where we have seen change is in what's called negative partisanship. How do you feel about the other party? And that's dropped from about 50 down to around 30. And
wow.
So in that sense, how we feel about members of the other party, we don't necessarily love our own party more. We just hate the other party more.
Right. Here's a couple of graphs I used in Giving the Devil His Due. Is this Pew study down here showing the spread apart of the centrists. So more people identified further right and further left. Fewer people are identifying in the middle. That would be from 1994 to 2014. And then the other one that you just mentioned was this graph, which is how much you hate, hate Republican Party, hate Democratic Party, partisan hatred for the other party, data from 2016 Pew Research Center. So it really shows a spike around, what is that, around 2008, it really takes off, right?
Right.
So now we're talking Obama. Yeah, okay, and then it's only gotten worse since then. Yeah, so is it obvious why that is? Is it conservative talk radio on one end and all the blogs and podcasts and the liberals on the other end, or whatever, MSNBC, whoever you want to pick there, of just fueling that, just like starting with Rush Limbaugh, but going now with Fox News. I mean, they don't just say, well, these guys differ from us. I mean, they're evil. They want to destroy America. They want to take your freedoms away. They want to turn your children all into gay, transgender. They want to destroy the military. They want, and they just go on and on. If that's what you watched, how could you not hate the Democrats or the libtards?
Right. Yeah, it's there is a lot of debate about this. I mean, it's a super complicated development, and it's probably the result of a bunch of different variables. And I would think that cable news would have a lot to do with it. Social media would have a lot to do with it. At least they're accelerants. There is talk about this sort of pushing back into the 60s, like when you started to get, those liberal Republicans becoming liberal Democrats, or those conservative Democrats becoming, conservative Republicans, and there wasn't any cross-party sort of bipartisanship efforts anymore. There's stories about even how just sort of the norms in Washington, D.C. changed, and there are people that don't buy some of these theories, but the idea that they used to be in Washington, D.C. more, they used to live in Washington, D.C., their families were there, their kids would play Little League Baseball together, and so they had these personal relationships with members of the other party, and now that doesn't really happen. They're not in D.C. as much anymore. They fly home, so their families usually stay in their home districts or states, and so there's not really any of that social networking that took place. And then there's, I think, Lily Mason has wrote a book a couple years ago that she sort of she was a political scientist. She used to be at University of Maryland. I don't think she's there anymore, but It was called Uncivil Agreement. And she talked about sort of how the parties are becoming more homogenous. And so our other kind of identities are starting to fall under the umbrella of our party identity. And it's becoming what she calls a mega identity. And so people of color are migrating to the Democratic Party. And so you have fewer people of color in the Republican Party. Evangelical Christians are all migrating into the Republican Party. If you went back, I mean, even in the 50s, it was more evenly split. You had a lot of black Republicans, and now you don't. You had a lot of evangelical Democrats, and now you don't. And so as sort of these other identities start to go around and rotate around our partisan identities, that sort of is a stand-in for all of our other, racial identities, ethnic identities, religious identities. And so if our party loses, it's not just our party that lost, it's our race, it's our ethnicity, it's our religion, and that can feel a lot more threatening.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Why do we have two parties? Let's take us back to the founding and first of all, why do we have parties in the first place? And then second, why do we have a duopoly? There's this idea called the Duverger's law, right? Duverger's law states that two parties are a natural result of a winner-take-all voting system.
Right.
So Europe doesn't have this, so they have 6, 7 viable parties, and nobody gets a majority, and everybody has to compromise, and that seems rational. Mm-hmm. But that just seems impossible. Even somebody rich like Ross Perot just couldn't do. Even Trump probably could not have done it unless he was a Republican. He could, as an independent or whatever, his Trump party. It just seems impossible. Why is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you hit on it when you talked about structural. So to answer your questions about why do we have two parties, it just sort of developed that way. Of course, when the founding, after the founding, and then with the Constitution was adopted, they didn't want political parties. I mean, they called them factions back then, but they thought they were very dangerous and that we shouldn't have them, and that people should think about the national interest and not what is good for your particular faction. But that didn't really, that lasted while Washington was in office, and then as soon as he retired, we sort of got these two parties, and it was the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans, and sort of had that tradition ever since. And but the structural things that we have in our system is the winner-take-all system. It's really hard. So at the presidential election, 48 out of the 50 states have a winner-take-all system. The only difference is Maine and Nebraska. But the winner-take-all system essentially says if you get the most popular votes in a given state, you win 100% of the electoral votes. And so whoever gets the most votes wins them all. And generally speaking, a third-party candidate would have a hard time winning the most votes. And that's true for the House of Representatives and the Senate as well. We're not doling out electoral votes, but it's the same that you're, in a single-member district, say in a House district, and you have candidates running. And you can have multiple candidates running, but it's whoever gets the most votes gets the seat. And it's really hard for a third party to beat out either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. And a lot of European systems have proportional systems where you're not running just single candidates against each other. They basically come up with they wouldn't have a single member in a district. They might have a certain geographic area, and they might have 10 candidates who are going to represent that area. And so you essentially are going to be electing 10 people. And people mostly vote party, and the parties would have a list of their 10 people. And if you get 40% of the votes, you get 4 seats. You get 50% of the votes, you get five of those 10 seats. But that enables third parties, like if you might only get 10% of the vote, but you get a seat. So now you're in the government, you have a seat at the table. And then you could potentially play a role in, if there is no party that secures a majority, then you can play a role. Maybe they have to appeal to you to bring you into a governing coalition that gives you significant influence, over the government and the direction of the government.
That seems way more rational than what we're doing. Why is there? attempts to get rid of the Electoral College always fail. Why is that?
Well, it's politics.
Yeah.
It was kind of close. There was an effort in the late 60s and early 70s, a bipartisan effort, and it was really close. And it just didn't happen. What you would need to do, of course, is you'd have to amend the Constitution because the Electoral College is in the Constitution. And so that requires that not only Congress propose this thing, you would need 2/3 of Congress to propose it, but then you would need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. And if you are, the Electoral College gives small states extra influence over a presidential election than they would have. And as a result of that, because every state gets 2 electoral votes that are associated with their seats in the Senate. And so smaller states have a huge influence in the Senate, and that carries over in the Electoral College because that's based on the number of people you have in Congress. And the small states they would never vote for it. And now it's become more of a partisan issue because Democrats are more willing to get rid of it because they look at what happened in 2000 when they won the popular vote but lost the presidency, and then they look at what happened in 2016 when they won the popular vote but lost the presidency. And so they want to abolish it, and Republicans obviously don't. And I think most political scientists think that that's just sort of a temporary thing. It doesn't necessarily benefit one party or the other, especially not in the long run. But I just think small states would be really unwilling to kind of give away that power because they do have some extra influence over it. And so I don't really foresee it happening. There are other proposals out there that could maybe be a workaround amending the Constitution, where states sort of all pledge that whoever wins the national popular vote, every state will give their electoral votes to that candidate. And so they would basically win, unanimously. There are others, like the way that Maine and Nebraska do it is actually much fairer. And they essentially do it by congressional districts. So whoever wins the popular vote statewide, they get the 2 electoral votes that are associated with the Senate. But then all of the other electoral votes, they just go district by district. So if you win the congressional district, you get that electoral vote that's associated with that district. And that's a lot fair because Democratic presidential candidates win districts in Texas, Republican presidential candidates win districts in California, and they would pick up electoral votes that way. And the electoral vote would be a better reflection of the popular vote in that instance. The problem is you would need every state would have to agree to do it and not go back on their word. And that's tough.
Right. And wasn't there something about candidates then would not even go to most of the states? They'd just go to the biggest, largest populous cities to campaign, and that'd be that. Yeah,
there's fear that whatever states have the most electoral votes, but and you would start to see, I think, Republicans would start spending more time in California. Maybe Democrats would start going down to Texas because you could win some of those things. But right now, I mean, they don't visit a lot of states either anyway.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a handful of, Florida, not even probably Florida anymore, but, certain battleground states like Pennsylvania and so on. I live in New York, and I never see TV ads on television. They never come here. They might come for a fundraiser, but very rare public events and things like that. So
it'd be a waste of time for Republicans, and Democrats don't need to because they're going to get the vote anyway.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So many people just vote their party. One amongst the probably overdetermined number of causes to explain Trump is that a lot of Republicans didn't like him and they don't appreciate his values, but he's our guy. And so, we're stuck with him and not voting Democrat ever. So got to vote Trump.
Yeah. And I think, and this sort of goes back to your past question. I would like to see more ranked choice voting. I think there's a lot of changes that need to be made if we were ever to sort of break out of the two-party system. But ranked choice voting, I think, has the potential to reduce some of the acrimony and tension between the parties, at least some of the candidates in the campaigning, because so ranked choice voting is essentially you rank your choices. You vote for however many candidates are running, and so this just recently happened in Alaska, and so you pick your first choice, your second choice, and say your third choice. And there were a lot of Republicans in Alaska. Sarah Palin was running, and there were a lot of Republicans who didn't like her, and so they picked the Democrat as their second choice, and then she ended up winning. The Democrat didn't have quite a majority, wasn't over the 50% plus one threshold, the 40-something%. And then if no one wins the majority, then they essentially eliminate, the last place person and then sort of redistribute the votes. There's different ways that you can do it. There's different kinds of ranked choice voting, and you essentially just sort of redistribute, go to second choice and third choice until someone has a majority. And it can encourage people, like if I'm a Republican and I'm running and there's a couple of Democrats say running, and that was what was happening in Alaska. You had a Democrat and then two Republicans. You don't want to trash the Democrat if you're a Republican, or vice versa, because you want basically their supporters and their voters to pick you as their second choice, and that could potentially have the impact of sort of reducing some of that vitriol that goes back and forth between the parties and the campaigns. And it does open up people into potentially voting, for a candidate of the different party if those folks sort of start to present themselves as a more moderate candidate, a more centrist candidate, because they're appealing to the other party or centrists or whatever to try to get their vote. But I think, what you were asking about this in the idea of just voting our party, that's largely the premise of the book, and trying to encourage people not to do that, because it's pretty common. And we the what's called the folk theory of democracy is this idea that the ideal citizen is supposed to look at all the issues, gather all the evidence. If I'm thinking about the flat tax, and I should go out and I should look at the best evidence in favor of it, the best evidence opposed to it, objectively evaluate that evidence, draw my conclusion, and then sort of look, okay, what party, if I decide I'm opposed to the flat tax, okay, what party opposes the flat tax? And all right, maybe I'm going to provisionally support that party, and then sort of have to look at all the other issue positions. But we don't do that. We have our party attachments. There's a great debate in political science whether this is nature or nurture. But however we get it, or if it's a mix of the two, we have our party identification, our party attachments pretty early on in life. We form them uncritically. It's like religion. If you were raised in a Catholic household, you're going to be a Catholic, and you're 4 or 5 years old when you're learning this stuff. You're not going to be questioning that, right? And it's the same thing with politics. And we're raised in a certain household, or we're around certain friends, and we sort of adopt that party identity, and then that completely warps everything that comes thereafter, right? And so then we start to, all the motivated reasoning stuff, we start to selectively look for information, and we selectively evaluate. We'll just accept whatever supports our view, and really be hypercritical about stuff that does not, and it completely warps everything thereafter. And it could have really negative consequences for democracy.
You have this nice diagram here. I'll read it looks like it's backwards the way I see it. Maybe it comes out the other way when it's broadcast here anyway. So on the left is the tribal theory of democracy. 1, identify with the political party. 2, adopt parties' political opinions. 3, subjectively acquire, perceive, and evaluate information. So what you're saying is that's what actually happens, mm-hmm. Whereas the folk theory of democracy is what, in principle, would be nice if people did this. Objectively acquire, perceive, and evaluate information. 2, form political opinions. 3, provisionally support a political party. Yeah, right. That's too funny. Well, yeah. So I have read a little bit about this. So the nature nurture thing. So let me see if I can frame it this way and tell me if I'm getting this right. That by temperament, we know temperament is at least 50% heritable from behavior genetic studies. Okay. To whatever extent you're introverted, extroverted, or openness to experience, or neuroticism, or agreeableness, disagreeableness, and so forth. So you are a certain way by temperament, and you like to hang around people that are kind of like that, or they present a worldview, or this party presents a worldview that kind of gels with the way you feel about things. So if you like a hierarchical, predictable, structured social system because that makes you feel more content or less anxious, or you like a predictable worldview, you like to know where everything's going to be every single day going forward. There are people like this. Other people just couldn't care less, right? And so then by temperament, you're going to kind of move in the direction of, well, who are the people that are into this? This could be religion too. I kind of like that religion or this political party, whatever, because it kind of feels like these are my people, right? Then you adopt the position. Okay, so what is their position on taxes and abortion and immigration or whatever? And then you do the motivated reasoning. Is that kind of the thinking on the nature nurture thing?
Yeah, there's different aspects to it because there's been different studies on it, but that's clearly one of them. We like attracts like sort of thing. But there were some studies that they hooked liberals and conservatives up to all kinds of different, EKGs, measuring your heart rate, measuring how much your palms are sweating. And then they showed you pictures, and some of them were sort of threatening pictures. And some of an early study found that conservatives had a stronger fear response than liberals. And so then they just sort of theorized, well, if someone who has this particular personality that sort of sees the world as more dangerous, then that would make sense of why they would be less supportive of, say, gun control, or they would be more supportive of restricting immigration so they could, they think the world's a dangerous place, they could protect themselves and so on. But that study hasn't been replicated. Then people have tried to replicate it, and they found that basically there isn't really a partisan difference, that liberals and conservatives have the same fear response, but they just fear different things, and that would be more nature. So if you're raised to fear climate change and think it's a major problem, and you're told it's a major problem, you're going to be afraid of that. And if you're not told that, you're not going to be afraid of it. But if you're raised in a household that says like immigrants are dangerous, then that's what you'll fear. And so that's more of some of this stuff hasn't been replicated, and it's still being debated. But it's hard. It's a tough problem. It's a tough problem to figure out.
I discussed that John Jost study. Stanford University social psychologist John Jost and his colleagues published a paper in the prestigious journal Psychological Bulletin entitled Political Conservatism as Motivated Social Cognition, which was a synthesis of 50 years of findings published in 88 papers encompassing 22,818 subjects that led researchers to conclude that conservatives suffer from uncertainty avoidance, terror management, and have a need for order, structure, and closure, along with dogmatism and intolerance of ambiguity, all of which leads to resistance to change and endorsement of inequality in their beliefs and practices. I remember when this was published, Republicans just heads exploded. It's like, oh yeah, so this is like a cancer. What's the explanation of the cause of this cancer? Right? Like it's a disease. Like like Jost and his colleagues the question they're asking is, why would anybody be a Republican? It's like, why would you want cancer?
Right.
And so, just the premise seemed pretty flawed now. And I cited that with Jordan Peterson, one of our podcast conversations. And he said, this has not been replicated and it has flaws and so on. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even, there's also like Jonathan Haidt's work with moral foundations theory. There's been some studies that have called that into question too, because he found, and wasn't necessarily looking for this, but found that liberals and conservatives sort of emphasize different values. But again, some of the challenges of that is like, well, it kind of depends on the question that you ask, right? And
Right.
so he says that conservatives have are much higher on the value of sanctity, and so if they see the flag as sacred, and that's why they get upset if someone's burning the flag, and liberals aren't so much so. But if you have talk about maybe genetically modified food or something like that, liberals sort of hold organic food as sacred, or natural spaces as more sacred. And conservatives were supposed to really have a higher respect for authority, where liberals were much more dismissive of authority. But they weren't. Conservatives aren't in particularly respectful or deferring to Joe Biden or Obama. It's like we respect our authority, but not the other side's authority. And so even our values are, they can shift depending on the issue and depending on our party's position on those issues.
Yeah, I was just looking for a citation here, but I'll get that in a second. Yeah, so that was, I like Jonathan Haidt's stuff because it doesn't automatically derogate one party over the other as if, one is a problem and the other is not. Because you could easily conceive of, well, let me see how I put it here. Let's see what liberals think of conservatives. This is a couple slides from my PowerPoint on this. Conservatives are a bunch of Hummer driving, meat eating, gun toting, small government promoting, tax decreasing, hard drinking, Bible thumping, black and white thinking, fist pounding, shoe stomping, morally dogmatic blowhards. When I read that, the liberals go, yeah, they are. And then I read the next slide. What conservatives think. Liberals are a bunch of hybrid driving, tofu eating, tree hugging, whale saving, sandal wearing, big government promoting, tax increasing, bottled water drinking, flip flopping, wishy washy, namby pamby bedwetters. And the conservatives go, yeah, they are. Right. So yeah, Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations at least takes the element of judgment out of it. Everybody believes in flag and family and sanctity and all that, but just conservatives more so than liberals, and liberals are more into the defending the individual who suffers, or poor people and so on. And it's not that Republicans don't want to help poor people. It's just that they just have a different way of going about helping them, that sort of thing. Yeah. So I do like that.
There's And along those lines, there's some great research done on stereotypes of the other party, and Democrats vastly overestimate how many Republicans are rich, how many Republicans are old, and then Republicans vastly overestimate how much of the Democratic Party, what percentage of the Democratic Party is black, or what percentage of the Democratic Party is gay, what percentage is atheist. We really don't know what the other party is like. We have these ideas in our head, and that could be on these demographics, or like we were talking about earlier, like the issue positions. A lot of people tend to be way off on that sort of thing. And even when, there's one of my favorite studies, James Fishkin out of Stanford. I think he just does wonderful work, and he, even when we are apart on issue positions, he does this program called America in One Room, and he calls it deliberative public opinion. And they get a sample of people, just as if you were doing a poll. They get a sample of Americans, and they get them all in one room, and you have the entire spectrum of Americans and their political beliefs. And they bring them in for a weekend or a week, and they provide them with packets of paper where they're going to be debating a series of issues, and they've got the pros and cons on those issues. And then they bring in an expert on each side of that issue. And then those experts are there to field questions after the people read through these materials. Then you can ask them questions. And then they ask you about your position afterwards. They sort of pre-test, post-test. They asked you before you came in, and then asked afterwards. And it's extraordinary what happens, because oftentimes there'll be movement towards the middle. Liberals will become a little bit more moderate. Conservatives will become a little bit more moderate. And there's sort of this meeting in the middle. But what's even more fascinating, I think, to me is sometimes it's the golden mean fallacy, right? To just say the correct answer is always in the middle. Sometimes one side is right and the other side is just wrong. And what he found is, even in those instances, you get people moving closer together. So, for example, they were doing like DACA, and he asked, DACA was for kids who were brought here, their parents came here illegally. They pretty much have been here their entire lives. They don't know anything else, and whether or not they should be deported or whether there's a path to citizenship. And so they asked, at the beginning of this, and Democrats, I don't remember the precise numbers, but Democrats were, supported DACA, like 95% of Democrats supported DACA, and say only, again, I'm making these numbers up, but say like 30% of Republicans. So there's this huge gap. And then after this weekend of debating and discussing this, liberals actually became more liberal on the issue. They went from like 95% support to 98% support. But there was actually less polarization because Republicans like drastically moved from like, say, 30% to 60% support, and they, from opposing to supporting. Because for many of them, for the first time, they were hearing counter arguments and they're like, wow, those are really good arguments and I support this now. And it happened the other way for different things. It was like Biden's baby bonds program, where they were going to provide money for every child that was born, in the United States, and they could use that later in life. Democrats started out as in support, and Republicans were really against it. And after debate, Republicans became even more against it. So they were moving even more to the extreme, but Democrats drastically moved as well in the conservative direction. And so even when we do have these, and his central argument is, you can ask people in a poll, what is your opinion on this issue or that issue? And they'll just give it to you. And it's largely based on, okay, what's my party? What is the talking point? But it's not deliberative. They don't really know that issue. And when you actually get Democrats and Republicans to sit down in a room together and actually talk to each other and learn about the issue, on a lot of these, you come closer together. Sometimes that's in the middle, and sometimes that's even further to the right or further to the left. And so I think there's just a lot of misperception out there about what the other party's like, and even what these issue positions are about. And that's another thing I'm trying to encourage with the book, is to encourage people, to show a little humility that I'm not a policy expert on this, and maybe I shouldn't have this really, really strong opinion about this issue that I know very little to next to nothing about.
It's like when NAFTA was being debated and everybody had a position, and then I forget who actually did this survey, but asked people, well, what is NAFTA? Well, it's that thing, about trade. They just had no idea what countries were involved or whatever.
Yeah.
In other words, so this is what you call the illusion, or somebody calls the illusion of understanding.
Right.
Like, you have that example, complete the bicycle. Let me see if I can find it in your book here, because I set up my background to help you with this. Here with my bike in the background. Let me see. So the drawing is a partial bike, and you're instructed to fill out the rest of the parts. What page? Oh, let me see if I can find that here.
Let's see.
It was kind of early.
I'm sure you were able to do this given your background. On page 47.
47. There we go. Okay, here we go. Right. So there's the incomplete bicycle, and you're supposed to draw in basically the down tube and the stays and the chain and the pedals. So here's my bike. There we go. So move that out of the way. All right. So as you can see, there's a down tube here, and then there's some chain stays here, and then the chain and pedals are here. That's kind of funny. I did that just for you.
Thank you.
But that's the thing. You ask people, do you know how a zipper works? Oh, of course. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Explain how a zipper works. Well, the little thingy with the doohickey, and you just go like that. It's like,
yeah. Yeah.
What?
And that
that's for simple stuff.
Right. Yeah. And it's, as you said, like, Sloman and Fernbach did some research on this, and they asked people about a host of different policy issues, and they had really strong opinions about it. And they said, well, just, okay, how does this work? And they couldn't. And it was like with the bicycle, that was Rebecca Lawson, I think, a psychologist, did it. And it's comical to look at some of these pictures. And I do it in class, and the kids can't do it. It's hilarious. So they've got like the chain going from the front tire to the back, and it's like you wouldn't be able to turn the bike or anything, and it applies to politics, and it's a wonderful exercise in sort of that kind of generating that humility and understanding that we're not all policy wonks, and it's okay. We don't have to be. We just have to acknowledge that fact, and then maybe we would be a little bit less strident about our views.
And does that explain how, if I know one position you hold, I can predict your other positions? Here's how I wrote it in. Let's see, this was the Believing Brain 2011. Let's see, if you are a conservative, if you are a liberal, I predict you read the New York Times, listen to progressive talk radio, you watch CNN, you hate George W. Bush, you loathe Sarah Palin, adore Al Gore and revere Barack Obama. You're pro-choice, anti-gun, adhere to the separation of church and state, are in favor of universal health care, vote for measures to redistribute wealth and tax the rich in order to level the playing field, and believe that global warming is real, human-caused, and potentially disastrous for civilization if the government doesn't do something dramatic and soon. If you're conservative, I predict that you read the Wall Street Journal, listen to conservative talk radio, watch Fox News, love George W. Bush and venerate Sarah Palin, despise Al Gore and abhor Barack Obama. You're pro-life, anti-gun control, believe that America is a Christian nation that should meld church and state, and are against universal health care, vote against measures to redistribute wealth and tax the rich, and are skeptical of global warming and our government schemes to dramatically alter our economy in order to save civilization. Mm-hmm. How is it possible if I don't even know you? If I know you're pro-choice, then I know you're going to be in favor of gun control and more liberal on the border and immigration policy. How is that possible? I don't even know you.
Yeah. Well, that's the power of political tribalism. It's this is our creed. This is what we believe. These are the sources we use, and and you can see that when things do become so tribal that a lot of the vitriol is even within a party, and for people who don't check all of those boxes, you're even worse than the other side. You're a traitor to your own team, and
a rhino. You're a rhino.
A rhino, right? And that it's another toxic part of our politics. It's not just the between party stuff, but even within the party and sort of the purity tests that go along with that. And it's not really healthy for democratic society. Democracies are supposed to be premised upon deliberation, and that sort of stuff just goes against deliberation, against humility, against curiosity, and sort of just beats down anybody who does not toe the party line, and that's never good for a democracy.
Yeah, although I guess people in each party might say, yeah, we're playing the game the way it's structured, but we really do believe those things are deeper truths, like immigration or pro-life versus pro-choice. It's like with conservatives voting for Trump in hopes he would get them the judges they need to overturn Roe v. Wade. Well, they did that, and he did. Now, to be sure, as somebody pointed out, had it been a president, Ted Cruz or Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, probably would have picked those same three judges for the Supreme Court, or three very much like them because of that Federalist Society that recommends to presidents potential picks for the Supreme Court based on their conservative values and so on expressed. So probably so. But they wouldn't say, we're just doing this for power. They would argue, I know because I've heard them argue this, we're doing that because we really are against abortion. We really do think it's murder.
Right.
And that's a deep moral value for us. So yes, we're playing the political game the way it's set up. We'll vote for this Trump guy. We don't like him, but he's going to get us our judges because this is the thing we care about.
Yeah, and and that is what democracy is about, right? I mean, it's majority rule, and if you have these positions and you win, then you get to pass legislation and appoint judges and all that stuff. My counter to that would be, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they might not. Abortion is a little bit of a different issue because people tend to have pretty strong opinions on that. But for a lot of issues, people just they don't think about it, and then they just adopt their party's view or they ignore their party's view. So there's a great, it's an older study, but by Jeffrey Cohen, I think from Yale, and it was on welfare. And I lay that out in the book. I don't remember all the details, but I mean, it was stark. He had two welfare proposals. One was incredibly generous. A lot of money every month, free 2 years of college, childcare paid for, healthcare paid for, way more generous than the U.S. has ever had. And then he had another, a far less generous proposal with very little money, and then you only get it for a little time, and then you don't get any more. And the trick was, of course, in his study, he said that the Democrats are supporting the really strict policy and the Republicans are supporting the really generous policy. And then he asked people, what do you support? And you had all these Republicans basically saying, yeah, free college for 2 years and let's pay for childcare. And all these Democrats saying, no, absolutely not. We can't do that. We can't afford that. And so it's just, I think there are certain issues that people know about and care about and are passionate about. But on so many things, there's so many examples of it. Like Democrats, Republicans were always for a southern border wall more than Democrats were. But before Trump, you had, it was like, I think around like 50% of Democrats supported a wall on the southern border. As soon as Trump came out for it, it plunged. And the number of Republicans who support it went up. And so that happens a lot on both sides is, our issue positions are so flexible, and whatever our presidential candidate or party leader tells us, then, we'll toe that party line. And that's the problem. It's not when people have well-informed, strong policy issues and they're voting on those issues. And, and you might have to overlook a couple things about because, there's 10 issues here and I support this candidate on 8 of them, and so I'm going to vote for them. That's fine. The problem is when we just go with the wind and our opinions are changing because they're not really grounded in anything other than party. And that's not self-government. I mean, self-government is that we vote for people who will, on the most basic level, like the democratic theory level, we vote for people who will represent us. And if we don't know what our issue positions are, or we're just basically saying, tell me what my issue position is, and then we're voting for those people, and then they're passing these policies that we might not really agree with or might not really believe if we actually took the time to study these issues, right? Like the Fishkin example I was telling you about, he brings these people in and they study the issues, and all of these people are changing their political opinions on those issues because now they're informed. We're electing people who are pursuing policies. Many of us are electing people pursuing policies that, if we were really informed, would not subscribe to. And furthermore, like on a deeper level, this is not self-government in a more philosophical sense, right? That if we cannot truly govern ourselves, like our tribal nature, if we cannot rein that in, our partisan instincts, we are letting these emotions, these tribal instincts govern us. And that is not self-government in the sense that the framers and founders envisioned it. It's not, going back to Greek philosophers, Socrates and Plato, of governing yourself, gaining control of your instincts and emotions. It's not democracy if it's not self-government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the party switching positions is interesting. I'm just thinking about Russia. That it was always conservatives that were, against Russia, against communism, and the Dems who were a little too friendly. And then all of a sudden, now just with Trump, I think it switched. What's the explanation for that? That's just Trump, right? Probably no other reason.
Yeah. He came out, had nice things to say about Putin. And then, Democrats were coming to believe that Russia was trying to help Putin help Trump get elected, and so Democrats hated Russia, and some Republicans were much more favorable towards Russia, because Trump was saying nice things about him, and so that was enough, right? That was enough for these parties to switch. And there's stories about that too, with like the individual mandate from Obamacare, that it was originally sort of a conservative idea that came up in the 90s, and Democrats hated it and Republicans liked it. And then when Obama proposed it, Democrats liked it and Republicans hated it. So it seems to happen quite a bit.
Yeah, it's like on figuring out what's true, most of us do not have access to expert knowledge. It's hard to know. So you just go by what the boss says, or the leader, or like the rigged election, until AG Bill Barr came out and said, well, we looked into it and there's just nothing there. How would I know who to call in Georgia or Arizona to find out if what that video actually means? This blurry, grainy video at 2 a.m. of this truck pulling in and people carrying boxes, and Fox News guys, oh, you can clearly see it's like, you can't clearly see anything. I don't even know what I'm looking at. Right. And, so how would I know? Well, the boss says X. Okay. Then I guess that's it. Right. Normally we trust, when Walter Cronkite says X, Vietnam is, going bad. Oh dear. Okay. You trust that authority, that's a big problem you identify in the book, is this sort of this breakdown of trust of authority. Okay, a couple other things. Oh, then on the abortion issue, right. So do you have a sense of why that became an issue for the Republicans? It wasn't, say, pre-1980s, right? It was maybe the religious right and the moral majority, and Reagan was, he wasn't a big pro-lifer person until I think Jerry Falwell said, if you really push this, I can get you tens of millions of votes. Okay.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's the story that I've heard, is that it really wasn't a national issue, of course, till Roe. But then there was this attempt by the moral majority, evangelical Christians, to sort of come together and form an alliance with Catholics. And there had always sort of been this tension, right, between Catholics and Protestants, and but Catholics tended to be pro-life, and so they saw this opportunity to sort of bring these two factions together and kind of create this voting bloc based on that issue, and that's when things started to become more partisan on that. And even there, like there was, I can't remember where I read it, but looking at the changes at that time in people's views on abortion, and that you did start to see that issue was important enough to some people that they decided to switch parties based on that issue. So you had some, and it was particularly like, if you had Republican women and then the Republican who were pro-choice, then they would become Democrats. Or if you had a pro-life woman who was a Democrat, she would then become a Republican. But it wasn't quite as, stark for men. They have, less skin in the game on that. And I think, if I remember correctly, the men more just sort of changed their position on abortion. So if you were a Republican and maybe you were, like pro-choice, but now your party is pro-life, then you're like, okay, I'm pro-life now, and vice versa for Democrats. So women were kind of switching their parties, and the men were switching their issue position.
Right. So maybe people have one or two issues that they care about, and the other 8 or 10 they don't really care about. And the party that supports the one or two they like, okay, then that's my party. The others, I'll just go along with it. I don't even know much about it. Whatever. Right.
Yeah. And that could be the case for some people for certain, and then I think for a lot of it, it's so hard to tease that out though, because for a lot of people, again, we form these identities pretty early on, and then sort of have these issue positions, and a lot of time they're sort of connected. If you're growing up in a conservative church that is pro-life, you're going to be Republican. So which kind of comes first? It's hard to tease that out sometimes, but there are people in the American public who are more ideological, who sort of have these strong issue positions, and many of them have looked into them and have some good understanding on what those are. And then there's a lot of people who aren't, and they sort of fluctuate, their positions change, and that's sort of the group that I focus on in the book, and trying to encourage them to sort of think more deeply about the issues rather than just going with their party. And it's a tough sell. And I think three things have to happen. One, we need to teach critical thinking in schools, and but that is not a panacea. I do it. I have a critical thinking class that I teach, and the kids love it. But there's, I think we are pretty good, naturally pretty good critical thinkers. And there's another great study that it was done on the death penalty. I think Lord, Ross, and Lepper, and they had these. I won't get into all the details of it, but they basically had a couple studies. One was within a single state study, and they said it was a before and after study. So this was the homicide rate before, and then this state had the death penalty, and then this is, the homicide rate after. Or they did like an adjacent state comparison, where this state has the death penalty, this one doesn't. Let's look at their homicide rates. Of course, the trick was, they in some of these studies approved the death penalty was a deterrent, and in others it didn't. And then what they found was if you supported the death penalty, you went with a study that said the death penalty is a deterrent and vice versa, right? But the thing that I find fascinating about that study is they include some of people's responses of why they dismissed those studies, and they're really good. They make sense. I mean, they are legitimate criticisms of the study. They come out and they say, well, if you are just comparing before and after in this state, you only looked at like a year or 2 years. That could just be a weird year, right? You need a longer time because there could be regression towards the mean. Now, they're not calling it regression towards the mean, but that's basically what they're arguing. Your data set is too small. And then some of the adjacent studies, they were saying, well, you can't just compare those two states, because what if one state is poorer than the other? Right? This is confounding variables, right? They're not calling it that, but these are legitimate questions to ask about these particular studies. We can do this. The problem is we do this so selectively. And, so I think it's important, like the first thing, teaching critical thinking, you have to teach this to students. You have to, name these things: confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, all those sorts of things. Teach them that. But the second thing that you have to do is you have to try, and this is the harder part, is to sort of engender a critical thinking disposition. And you have to try to encourage students to be humble, like we were speaking about before. I always like asking my students, do you think you know everything? And of course they're going to say, no, I don't think I know everything. And then you say, okay, well, what are you wrong about? And it stumps them, right? Because, well, if I knew what I was wrong about, you'd think I wouldn't believe it anymore. But at least it sort of creates that sense of humility that, okay, I don't know everything. And then you could do the bicycle exercise that we were talking about earlier with them. And they always get a kick out of that and laugh at it. And then we also need to sort of generate a curiosity and get people to be curious about what does the other side think? Don't you want to know that? I mean, and not just the talking points from your own side, sort of dismissing what the other, like a genuine curiosity. I want to know what you think about this issue. Not to beat you over the head with it, not to win a debate. I just really want to understand where you're coming from. And then, the last thing I talk about is sort of, we are a tribal species, we are a social species, and, we do identify with our political parties, but maybe try identifying with other try to identify yourself, not say as first and foremost a Democrat or a Republican, but as a critically thinking citizen who is going to make a good effort to think critically about these issues, to cultivate that disposition within myself, and then try to surround myself with people who think the same way. And those last two steps, I understand, are a really heavy lift, but But if we start to change ourselves, I've seen this in myself and my own behavior. After I've read all this research and thought about this stuff, I have changed myself. And once that starts to happen, your friends start to pick up on it, and your spouses start to pick up on it, and you have influence on them, and you start to surround yourself with people who think like that. And it's just one person at a time. I know it sounds cliche, but and Russ Roberts wrote how Adam Smith can change your life, or something to that effect. And he talks in there about how you as an individual make very little difference, but all of us together can make a huge difference. And I stopped watching cable. I used to think that this was part of my responsibility as a citizen of the United States and as a teacher, right? That I should be watching Fox, I should be watching MSNBC. And I was more angry. I was more miserable, and I just stopped. And I think it's made me a better thinker, a better citizen. And, we can all do certain things like that. And it will make things better, I think, in the country if we, on social media, if we just stop retweeting or, copying and pasting and sending out and forwarding and just stuff that enrages us just because we're so mad, that we start liking people who are taking more of a moderate position. When you see somebody in a thread or something like that, just liking it when they say, well, I can see this side and this side. And I'm trying to do that more often. But it's tough.
Steel man the other person's position, right?
Right.
Can you explain why a Republican thinks this way? Most Democrats can't. Or, Trump was such a divisive figure, and as my listeners will know, I'm not a fan. But most of what he did until he lost his mind over the 2020 election was pretty standard Republican stuff, right? We're going to deregulate business and lower taxes and tighten up the border and, this and that. It's well, that's what Republicans do. That's literally their day job. He's just doing that. That's not crazy conservative politics. That's normal, right? So, but because he was so polarizing, people have a hard time thinking of anything positive. And to the point where, look, if 74 million people voted for him in 2020, they can't all be in a cult or brainwashed or evil or hateful or racist or, it's just not possible. It's half the voting population almost.
Right.
So, other things have to come into play. One of which I wanted to get your opinion on is George Lakoff's book, which was an eye-opener for me. Now, I don't read a lot of political philosophy, but his book was Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think. And here he's a cognitive psychologist who studies metaphors. So, the cosmos is a clockwork, or evolution like selective breeding, or the mind is like a computer. So his political metaphor, I know you're familiar with this, but I'll tee it up for the audience here, is the political metaphors is the nation as a family, with conservatives as a strict father family and liberals as a nurturant parent family. And from that, he says, much follows. Strict father model predictably adheres to the traditional nuclear family, with the father having primary responsibility for supporting and protecting the family, as well as the authority to set overall policy, to set strict rules for the behavior of children and to enforce the rules, while the mother has the day-to-day responsibility for the care of the house, raising the children, and upholding the father's authority. Obedience is the key to building character and self-reliance. Self-discipline, self-reliance, and respect for legitimate authority are the crucial things that children must learn. Much follows from understanding how this family metaphor plays out in the political arena. So here, I'm quoting Lakoff, with the nation as a family and the government as the parents, it's clear why conservatives contend that the purpose of government is to demand its citizens be self-disciplined, self-reliant, and to help themselves, and why liberals hold that the purpose of government is to help those who cannot help themselves through social programs. Then Lakoff summarized the implications of these metaphor differences, starting with the conservative strict father model, which assumes that the world is dangerous and difficult and that children are born bad and must be made good. The strict father is the moral authority who supports and defends the family, tells his wife what to do, and teaches his kids right from wrong. The only way to do that is through painful discipline, physical punishment that by adulthood becomes internal discipline. The good people are the disciplined people. Once grown, these self-reliant, disciplined children are on their own. Those children who remain dependent, who were spoiled, overly willful, or recalcitrant, should be forced to undergo further discipline or be cut free with no support to face the discipline of the outside world. So project this onto the nation, and you see that to the right wing, the good citizens are the disciplined ones, those who have already become wealthy or at least self-reliant, and those who are on the way. Social programs, meanwhile, spoil people by giving them things they haven't earned and keeping them dependent. The government is there only to protect the nation, maintain order, administer justice, and provide for the promotion and orderly conduct of business. In this way, disciplined people become self-reliant. Wealth is a measure of discipline. Taxes beyond the minimum needed for such government take away from the good, disciplined people and spend it on those who have not earned it. And then he says, by contrast, the nurturant parent model emphasizes love, empathy, and nurturance as the key to raising responsible and self-disciplined children. Obedience follows naturally from a child's love and respect for parents, and so on and so forth. So let me go to his larger scale. Specific policies follow from the nurturant parent model of government, such as government protection in the form of a social safety net and government regulation, universal education to ensure competence and fairness, civil liberties and equal treatment, fairness and freedom, accountability derived from trust, public service from responsibility, open government from open communication, and promotion of an economy that benefits all and functions to promote these values. Anyway, he goes on and on. You know the drill there. So what do you think about that? Maybe people are internalizing this metaphor, whether they know it or not, and that's reflecting on our differences.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's okay to disagree. I just thought it an interesting point of discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think it goes back to, at least in my mind, to some of the things that we were talking about, like nature nurture sort of question, and are Democrats and Republicans just different in how they see people, how they see the world, and I mean, I'm open to that. I mean, people are obviously different, and I think different personalities can lead people in different directions. But I also see so much flexibility in our party views and positions, and how we sort of apply those standards and views. There's a lot of conservatives who are very caring and loving, and there's a lot of liberals who think it's important to be respectful, and so I'm hesitant to sort of categorize groups, in that way, because I do think it does change, and so political scientists make a distinction between operational ideology and symbolic ideology, and they found that like a lot of people who identify as conservative, so that would be like symbolic ideology is how you identify yourself. So you ask someone, are you a conservative or liberal? And they say, well, I'm a conservative. But a lot of them actually hold very liberal economic positions. So they might be more conservative because they're religious, and so it might be like a pro-life thing, or maybe they're against gay marriage or something like that. But they're very supportive of social spending programs and that sort of thing. And so what do you do with that person, right? They identify as a conservative. They're like very likely a Republican, but they still sort of want those social programs, which other conservatives would say, well, that's creating this dependency, and that sort of thing. So it's just such a hard question to answer. Human behavior is so complicated, and there's so many variables at play, and it's probably different for different people. And it's tough to sort of, at least I haven't, in my own mind, I haven't been able to sort of come to a place where I feel comfortable saying this is what makes a liberal and this is what makes a conservative. And I think there's so many things that come into play in people's lives, and and some of it is probably nature, and a lot of it is nurture. And so I'm always hesitant to sort of these overarching sort of grand themes about how we all see the world. I think that definitely plays a role in how we see people and humanity and in the course of history. And I'm sure it has a huge impact on our political views. But yeah, I hesitate to draw any firm conclusions.
Certainly, yeah, I agree. No, I agree. It's, just have many voices in there, throw in a lot of variables and factors and see what sticks, and how much of the variance is accounted for by, I don't know, a dozen different factors, and there's probably still going to be unaccountable and unaccounted for variation. But like, for example, he talks about abortion and sex education, that sort of thing, right? So for conservatives, this is something that's private, should be done in the home. The schools have no business teaching sex education to children. Furthermore, just say no, like to drugs. Nancy Reagan's just say no to drugs. Just say no to sex, right? So they get these teenage kids to take these chastity pledges, right? I'm just not going to have sex. Well, we know how that turns out, right? Good luck with it. Easy to sign the pledge on Sunday morning at church. It's another thing the next Saturday night when you're out with your friends. But the idea behind that, so Lakoff's explanation is, well, it's like discipline, right? Just discipline yourself. And if the state says, we're going to come in there and help you, if you get pregnant, we'll take care of your abortion and we'll give you free birth control and all this stuff. To the conservatives, like, no. That's none of the state's business. That's my strict father, that's the family's job. And so, what's the problem? Why do we need social programs? Some of these people are just lazy, weak-willed. They don't have motivation, the welfare queen business that Reagan, of course, we know this is not true. Most people that are down on their luck just had bad luck, even to the point where if you are, half the people by definition are below the mean on the IQ bell curve, right? And, that has nothing to do with discipline or whatever. It's just, or their temperament. You're just born a certain way. Some people are born, they can't wait to get up in the morning, get out the door and work hard. Others just don't feel that way. And, some of that you can will and control, but some of it you can't, and there's going to be variation. So, yeah, I think maybe the strict father family metaphor versus the nurturant parent family metaphor explains some, but probably not everything. But it certainly explains some of the attitudes that some, say, Christian conservatives hold about sex and discipline. And why do we have abortion? Well, because we have unwanted pregnancies. Why are there unwanted pregnancies? Because people are having sex unprotected. Why are they having sex unprotected? They should do it. Wait till marriage, right? Just be disciplined. So that some people do feel that way, but realistically, that's not a viable, workable program there. Anyway, I'm just kind of riffing on that. All right, so let's talk about so much of your book is devoted to processing information, political information, ads, images, graphs, and charts, and so on. So we're recording this on the week that Tucker Carlson released the other selected clips from 41,000 hours of video footage from the January 6th insurrection that he says was just a peaceful tour of the Capitol by some, just visitors, right? And, so you have to say, when you watch the police with the QAnon shaman, it's like, what? Yeah, they're opening doors for him. They're just chatting with him. What the hell is going on here? Because we've all seen the other videos of all the violence. And of course, giving it to Tucker Carlson, what he's going to do with out of that 41,000. He's going to be very selective. And we know they lie right on air because they said so themselves in the Dominion voting machine trial. So, who should we trust? How do you think about where to get information like that?
Well, I think this is probably the part of the book that I get the most questions about or pushback about, because in general, in the political science literature, findings have said that when you look at the major news sources, and these would be like ABC, NBC, CBS, Nightly News, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, that those are the best sources, and that they don't have a partisan bias, that's a consistent bias in favor of one party or the other.
Outside of the opinion editorial section.
Right, outside of the opinion editorial page. And so, sometimes when they'll do content analyses, and they might skew a little this way, a little that way. This source goes a little this way, that source goes a little that way. But in general, your mainstream media are, for the most part, pretty good. And so I think people should have confidence in that. Conservatives clearly don't. And that's been something that, since really the 60s, the Nixon campaign used to, they sort of openly admitted that they were playing the refs, so to speak, to try to get more favorable coverage. And it's been something that, is constantly talked about. And I think that's happening more on the left now. At least I see it more. So it's anecdotal, but I see a lot on Twitter about liberals complaining about the New York Times and how they wrote this headline, or, and oftentimes they're referring to the editorial page, but saying, well, they included another editorial on this or that. And, but so it sort of creates this expectation. And and there have been studies that have shown when people expect a certain source to have a particular bias, that they see it. And it's funny because, there are people out there in these studies who think Fox is liberal, and, like MSNBC or whatever is conservative, because they just don't know. And so for people who think Fox is liberal, they'll watch something on Fox and be like, oh, this is liberal. This is really, really liberal. We see what we expect to see. And I think the other confusion is that, like you said, a lot of people, they read an editorial, or they'll come upon an editorial on Twitter or something like that, and it's from the New York Times, and it's a liberal editorial, and so they just associate that with the entire New York Times, and I see that quite a bit too. But it's an opinion; it's supposed to have an opinion, and it's harder today when you go to a website, because when you hold a physical paper, right, it's on the last couple pages, and it's big on top opinion, right, and on websites, a lot of times they are labeled, but it's harder to see, and it's all on the front page, and it's next to the news story. But one of the things that I do with my students a lot is I'll just take a day, and then I'll go to New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Fox. I pick the same story. So whatever is like the main story of that day, I just copy it, paste it, print it out, and I give them, these 4 articles, and it doesn't have the name of the paper on there. And I just say, okay, which are these? Tell me which one is the Post, the Times, and they have a really hard time doing it because they're all pretty much the same. And I have them count. I say, okay, think about, like, how are you going to determine this? Think about the tone of the language. Count how many times that they have a Republican speaking versus how many times they have a Democrat speaking. How many lines do they give the Democrat? How many lines do they give the Republican? And for the most of it, it's like dead on. They the same number of lines go to each side, and the same number of sources, generally speaking, right? And so they have a hard time doing this. Once you take that, this is a Washington Post or this is Fox News, online, their basic news reporting, it's harder to determine that. And there are other reasons too. I think the press is a business, right? And so they have structural biases where they're going to report on bad stuff. They have a general sort of adversarial relationship with politicians, and so they're going to report on bad stuff. And so you could see a story that, Trump said this today and it's not true, or Obama's the healthcare plan first went online today and it was a disaster. And if you're a Democrat and you see that last story, you assume that that's just because the paper hates Obama, but it's just because he's a president and he screwed up, and that's going to get coverage. And if there's a sex scandal, they're going to cover it, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. But people tend to interpret it, if it's against your party, they tend to interpret it as a partisan bias when it's just sort of these other kinds of biases. But so it's, I also talk about something called the hostile media effect, which this is also sort of weird too. They'll give the same article to Democrats and Republicans, and they craft them so they're neutral. There might be a positive statement about Democrats, positive about Republicans, and then like a neutral statement. And what they found out is when Democrats and Republicans read this, that they actually interpret neutral information as hostile towards their own candidate. So the one example I provide in the book, if they were talking about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump winning their nominations in 2016, and if they said just this sort of banal general statement that both candidates won their nomination, a Republican would look at that and say, that's so biased because the only reason Hillary Clinton won is because they cheated Bernie, right? And the Democrat would look at that and this neutral statement, and they'd say, well, that's the only reason Trump won is because he lied all the time, or they had this winner-take-all primary and they had 15 other candidates, and that's the only reason he won. Or they even look at positive statements about their own candidate. So if the newspaper said Trump was a businessman, a Democrat or a Republican would even look at that, a positive statement about their candidate, and say, he wasn't just a businessman, he's a great businessman, he built this and that. And if the Democrats said Hillary Clinton used to be Secretary of State, they would see that as a negative statement because, well, she was also, the First Lady, and she was also a senator from New York, and you didn't include that, and you're underplaying sort of her experience. And so we sort of we all perceive things in a different way. And so it's not so much that the bias is in what we're reading. It's a lot of times it's coming from ourselves. And that's super hard to detect, right? Because we think we're seeing the world objectively, but we're sort of projecting our own biases on it. So I always, in the book, I talk about encouraging people to just do some of those exercises sometime. Have someone print up a couple articles, take off what the source is and see if you can figure it out. Or if you have a friend from the opposing party, have them read it, you read it, and sort of compare your notes. It can be really enlightening by doing that.
Like wine tasting, if you don't know how much the bottle costs.
Exactly.
Oh, I can't tell. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so are we living in a post-truth alternative facts fake news world? Well, there's Bettinger's law, which is any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered no. Right.
Yeah.
Pinker makes this point in his book Rationality that it can't be true because who's asking the question and what's the criteria by which you're making a statement that we are living in a post-truth world and here's the evidence. Wait a minute, you're using evidence. You're making an argument. That's not a post-truth world, right? So let's just set aside the extremes, right? That we're still reasonably rational and so on. But everything you've pointed out and much more in the book is, it's really hard to reason rationally about these issues when, even if you're trained to look out for all these cognitive biases, which I do in my class too, there's still the bias. That is, you're just getting better at pointing out the cognitive biases in other people. Of course, I'm not subject to those. No way. Right? And so, I don't know how to get around that. I mean, there are these programs that try to de-bias people, but I don't think there's anyone for de-biasing yourself.
Yeah, it's constant practice and constant reminders. And it's associating with other people who will call you out on it. And unfortunately, I have a bunch of good colleagues that do that for me, but it's so hard. And you just have to sort of constantly keep after it. And I'll tell you a quick story about, and this is when it's so embarrassing. While I was writing the book, writing the part of the chapter about fake images and how to do reverse image searches and all that stuff, I was scrolling through Twitter and I came upon this image and it just sort of pressed all my buttons, right? And I thought it was hilarious and I immediately sent it to my friends. I've got several chat groups, and I sent it to a chat group that I have with all my colleagues at work. And as soon as I sent it, I was like, oh no, I should have, I didn't check this. I didn't reverse image search. And so now I'm like panicking, I'm in a cold sweat, and I went, and sure enough, even before I did that, when I looked at it more closely, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like this is a bad Photoshop. And sure enough, I did a reverse image search.
It's not that one, is it?
No.
With the judges, because that one's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, that was just, that's another example of just a really bad graph. But
yeah.
this was, it was like, it had numerology and stuff in there. So but they were like adding up numbers, and the numbers were wrong. So it was like, oh, look at these crazy people who believe in numerology and they can't even add, that sort of thing. And I reversed image search. It was fake. And then I had to immediately write to them and said, please don't forward this. I just did a reverse image search and it's fake. And I'm like, this is while I was working on that part of the book. And it's constant. It's on my head. I'm writing about it and I still screwed up. And
how do you do a reverse image search?
So whenever you find a picture, there's a couple ways you could do it, but I use a website called TinEye. I find that to be the easiest. And you copy and paste. You could do the link or even the picture, and you just plop it into the search bar, and then you hit return, and it searches for pictures just like it would for text. And so it will come up with this list, and you just can scroll through, and it looks for similar images. So if somebody has photoshopped a picture, and you'll see a lot of those photoshopped images, the same ones, but if you kind of keep scrolling through, then eventually, if it's been altered, you will see the original picture. Like sometimes something will come up from one of the fact check sources that has already debunked it, but even if they haven't, you could sort of debunk it yourself, and eventually you'll see the real picture, and then you can compare it to the one and say, oh yeah, they just changed this sign or this nameplate or whatever. And it's really easy. It's fun. I mean, it just takes a couple seconds, but there's so much, like, it's absurd, but I just wanted to be the one who shared it. And I wanted to get the laugh, and people would respond to it. It's like those dopamine hits, right? And that makes social media so addictive. And there's been some great research. Penny Cook and Rand did some research where they found that Democrats and Republicans, they'll ask people, like, talking about, are we living in a post-truth society? They showed people like real images and fake images, and people were actually pretty good at picking out what ones were real, what ones were fake, and real and fake headlines. And people were pretty good at it. But then they asked, is this real or fake? But then they asked, will you share it? And a lot of Democrats and Republicans said, this is fake, but I'm going to share it. And because they thought it was funny, or they thought their friends would appreciate it, right? And the problem is that, the more, if you share it, then they share it, and eventually someone's going to come across it and actually believe it's true. And it's sort of, that effect when you keep hearing something, then people start to believe it's true the more you hear it. And so the more people that are passing this on, so we have a bunch of people who are passing stuff on who know it's not true, but then somebody else is seeing this, oh, this is the third time I've seen this, maybe it is true. And so that's how some of this disinformation can spread as well. It's not, people are necessarily doing this to fool people, although there are a lot of people doing that as well. But it's sort of innocent stuff for kicks. And that's a lot of how a lot of these fake pictures start, by the way, too. It's somebody, remember the Palin in the bikini, standing by the pool. You remember that picture?
Yeah.
It was somebody, it was a young woman living in New York who thought it would be funny, and she did it for a couple of her friends on Facebook. And she photoshopped the image, shared it with her friends, and then it went viral. And she was like, I never intended for this to happen. It was a joke. I thought I was just sharing it with a couple of my friends, but this stuff can get out of control pretty quickly.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you know Andrew Doyle? He has the Twitter fake account, Titania McGrath, and basically making fun of woke progressive stuff. He just takes any position and then multiplies it by 3. Just takes the most extreme position to the point where it's pretty funny. But then it gets passed around and copied and forwarded, and at some point, no one knows who it is.
Right.
It's just like, look at what these crazy woke people are up to now, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of it, and it's the same with, like, The Onion. I mean, the Onion has like a lot of people now know that it's satire, but even some people fall for that still.
Right,
and then there's
Babylon
other satire sites too that people aren't as familiar with, and they're jokes, but people think it's true.
Yeah. Babylon Bee is another one of my favorites. All right. Explain losers' consent to election outcomes and winners' magnanimity.
Yeah. So this is the last chapter, and it's kind of the another negative effect of political tribalism. And this is happening obviously more recently with people just refusing to accept election outcomes. And so I start that chapter with I go back to Greek mythology, and I won't get into all the details, but it's such a great story, so I'll share some of it. It's the playwright Aeschylus wrote a trilogy called the Oresteia, and it's about this guy Orestes, and his dad is Agamemnon, who is leading the Greeks in the Trojan War. And when he comes home, his mother kills his father. And because she had this grudge against him, the father had killed the daughter, all this stuff. So, it's Greek tragedy. Everyone's getting killed and dying. And so, the father returns home from war. His mom kills his dad. And then he gets exiled. Well, it puts him in this moral conundrum because, in the ancient Greek world, you were supposed to, if anyone in your family was killed, you were supposed to avenge that death, you personally. But there was also a moral principle that you should not kill one of your parents. So what do you do if one of your parents killed your other parent, right? He's in this moral dilemma, and he decides that he has to avenge the death of his father. And so he goes home, and he kills his mom. And then he's being hounded by the Furies. These are like these creatures that sort of pursue killers of kin, and he's sort of being protected and defended by the god Apollo. And they end up in Athens, and they're making all this commotion, right? And Athena comes over, and she's like, "What's going on?" And they sort of tell her what's happening, and she says, "Well, I'm going to call together a group of citizens, and we'll essentially hold a trial, right? You make your case, you make your case." And before they hold the trial, she says to each side, do you agree to abide by the decision, whatever the people decide, do you agree to abide by that? And they both agreed. And so then they sort of conduct this trial, and in the end, Orestes is acquitted. The people side with him. And at that point, the Furies are furious, and they refuse to accept the decision. And at that moment, Athena sort of comes in, the goddess of wisdom, and she does a couple things. One, she says, first of all, you said you would abide by this decision, right? We laid out the rules for this, and you said you were going to abide by it. And just because you lost now doesn't mean that you can take your ball and go home, right? Mm-hmm. And then the other thing she did, and so that's a lesson for us, that if you lose an election, you lost, and you knew the rules of the game beforehand, and you have to accept that loss. You have to be gracious in defeat. But the other thing that she does is, and this is the magnanimity part, she has this conversation with the Furies, and she says, don't be upset. Don't try to, cause a civil war within our society. You will have a place in our society. You lost this vote, but you will be respected, and your point of view will be appreciated, and so on. And that I fear is being lost, lately in American politics, is that when we win, it's like we rub it in, and we take pleasure in the other side's pain. And now, I mean, it used to be when I was growing up, you would see political signs and things like that. But when the election was over, people took them down. People would wear maybe hats or political shirts during a campaign, put bumper stickers on their car, but then they took it off when the campaign was over. And now you see them constantly. There's flags, flying everywhere and between elections. So it's like this constant campaign where it's constantly in people's faces all the time, just sort of poking and prodding. And when you win an election, you can be thrilled and happy, but you have to understand that the other half of the country is feeling pretty down, and you should reach out to them. And even though you won, you should give them a place in the government. You should let their voice be heard. You should compromise with them. And even now, when the elections are always so close, but no matter what side wins, they're always like, we have a mandate. And you don't really have a mandate. I mean, it's like the country's pretty much 50-50. And so there seems to be this, like, the losers don't consent, and I say losers, that's what they call losers consent. It's not like, you loser, a derogatory thing. It's the people who lost the election. Yeah. They don't consent. They refuse to consent. They refuse to recognize the other side won, right? And so there's all this, the increased use of filibusters and all this stonewalling and all that takes place, that, we're going to make Obama one-term president. And that mentality is, all right, we lost this election, but we're going to make your life hell for the next 4 years, and we are not going to work with you. And we're going to try to stonewall everything so you don't have any accomplishments, right? There's no sense of what is good for the country or what's in the national interest. And then the winners are just trying to cram everything down the loser's throat. And so it just sort of creates this tension. And, the lesson that Athena was trying to tell people was, you have to be magnanimous in victory, but you also have to accept the loss, and you have to work together. And I think we've lost that as of late. I think on both sides of that issue, winning and losing. I just think, and it's dangerous because it has sort of that escalating effect. Well, if you did it to us, then we're going to do it to you when we're in power, and that rarely leads to a good place, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. This is a good place to kind of wrap it up here. I like the epigram for your preface here from Scott Simon. A supporter once called out, "Governor Stevenson, all thinking people are for you." And Adlai Stevenson answered, "That's not enough. I need a majority." That's classic. Yeah.
Yeah, and he lost twice.
Yeah, poor Adlai. That's right. He lost twice. Yeah. Well, that reminds me of, like, with the Bush-Gore 2020, there was that question, like, who would you rather have a beer with, and it was a big, well, W, he just seems like a good beer drinking guy, right? And Gore is there with his charts and graphs, like doing a PowerPoint presentation, right, on his campaign. And, so there was some criticisms of that, maybe politics is really more personality and emotion and not more system 1 than system 2 cognition, right? More kind of heuristics and bias and rapid cognition and how you feel about things rather than calculating the correct answer. Yeah, I've been playing around with the ideas of different kinds of truths, empirical scientific truths, religious truths that are kind of more mythological rather than reality based. And maybe there's political truths, although I'm conflicted about this, right? So, like when you mentioned, that the kind of the ethic of, the truth is somewhere in between. Well, sometimes, but oftentimes it isn't. You have a young Earth creationist that says the Earth is 10,000 years old, and a geologist says it's 4.5 billion years old. You don't add them up and divide by 2 to get the answer, right? But maybe if it's like, what's the right tax percentage for people that make $100,000 or more, $400,000 or more? Pick Biden's number. What's the right? Should it be 75% like it was in the 50s? Should it be 37% like it is now? What's the right number? And there isn't a right number. Right? It's like, well, this team wants it lower and that team wants it higher. So we, just fight and end up somewhere in the middle there. It goes lower, it goes a little bit higher. And there's not a correct answer there, right? Although, see, then it might be argued, no, there's a deeper truth underneath that number. That is, to what extent do we have a moral obligation to help people that are down and out? And for that, if we're going to do that, we have to tax more. You have to pay for it. Or on the other side, evil exists in the world. There are bad people and bad national actors. We need a strong military. And therefore, we have to spend more money for that. So we do need whatever the taxes are for that, and so on. So maybe, I don't know, I'm just kind of riffing here on some thoughts I've been having on that. What do you think?
Well, I think, I can't remember what book of yours you wrote about it, but you talk about, it's like, democracy is an experiment. It's like a scientific experiment.
Yeah.
You tinker with
That was
different
Jefferson's
variables.
idea. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think that when it comes to some of these political ideas, I there might not be a true value that we can sort of discern for an appropriate tax rate or something. But I'm sure there are better ones and worse ones, and I wish we had more of a sort of let's try it kind of attitude, and let's try it and see what happens, and see what happens to those deeply held. There some of these will help poor people more than others, and if it does, then we can show that, then maybe people would be, oh, okay, this is actually working. All right, let's have this. Or if it's too high and it's really stifling economic growth, and we can prove that and show that, okay, it's too high, let's bring it down. And it just sort of goes back to that humility idea that just stop thinking that either party has all the right answers, and let's just try something, let's see how it works, and let's look at the outcomes, and is it leading to better outcomes? Is it improving things, or is it not improving things? And to just sort of continue to have that curious, and that's where curiosity comes into, that curious attitude. And because again, I think, it goes back to that false polarization stuff we started with. I generally, and maybe I'm naive about this, I mean, I am an optimistic person, by nature, but I just think, we sort of have these ideas in our head that, you can't raise taxes because it's going to be disastrous for the economy. And so we can't have, it's not that I don't care about poor people or something like that, but I'm worried about if we raise taxes to try to have these social programs, the whole economy is going to tank and those people are going to be worse off. Well, if we can actually just get away from sort of the rigid ideology and rigid thinking on, and just say, well, let's try this. Let's see what happens to the economy. Let's see what happens to the unemployment rate. Are more of these people getting jobs? Do we have a robust enough social safety net? And just kind of see where it goes. But it's so hard to do that because, each side has its idea. And if something works, well, then if it's a victory for their side and their idea, well, then that makes us look bad. And so we don't even want to experiment with it, because if it works, then, it's going to suck for us. Where there should just be, I wish there was just more of an attitude of, who cares whose idea it was? Let's just see if it works. And if it works, great. And then let's move on to the next problem. But it's that tribal kind of competitive thing, that it's this zero sum, right? Thinking that if your idea works, then it's going to help you and it's going to hurt us. And rather than thinking it's going to help the country, and then you can be like, okay, well, good idea. And sometime your side's going to have the right idea too, and you would like the other side to say, hey, good idea, and we've solved 2 problems now, let's move on to the next one. But
yeah, the myside bias and the whole argument that Hugo Mercier makes, or was it Dan Spur, both of them, right? Mm-hmm. That we evolved reason not to understand the true nature of reality, but to win arguments for our side. And we're pretty good at that.
Yeah.
So we're pretty good at reasoning under the right context. So we just need to shift the context to less win-lose zero-sum games to, let's see what we can do to help everybody as much as possible, on average, improve the quality of life and so on. In politics, that's really its job.
Yeah. And I think that's like that's fair-mindedness, right? That Andy Norman talks about fair-mindedness, and that you have to be willing to yield to better reasons. And so, Mercier, when he says, you don't have to. The important thing too is you're having a conversation with the other person, right? So you're going to argue your side vociferously. They're going to argue their side vociferously, and then the idea is you will yield to whoever has the better argument. And we have a lot of people sort of just arguing by themselves with their own group, so we don't have a lot of this. It seems like we do, but we don't have a lot of cross-party conversation. But even when we do have those cross-party conversations, we're really not talking to each other. We're not listening to each other. We're not yielding to better reasons. And that's where the problems come to play, because that's not democracy. That's just beating each other over the head and shouting at each other and just assuming that your side is right and that the other side has nothing to offer. And it goes back to that question: do you think you're right about everything? And if you're not, then you need to maybe listen to what the other side is saying and assess your own arguments. That's the only way we'll move forward, is if we're willing to recognize when we're not right and the other side might have a good idea.
What's that called when you look for somebody that disagrees with you? Red teaming? You find somebody that's going to argue the opposite of you to test your idea?
I'm not familiar with the term.
I'm just thinking, I was trying to recall as you were speaking, Jonathan Haidt's been doing this with this question of what's the cause of the spike in teen depression and anxiety and cutting and suicidal ideation and so on. 3 times more in girls, like two times more in boys. Looks like it started around 2013, 2014. You see this giant spike in the data, but no one's in agreement about the cause exactly. You have, a couple different theories. So he's been really good about like just going out online and going, okay, here's what I think it is, but I could be wrong. Let's find, I think it was like a red team thing or whatever the term was. Yeah. Find somebody that thinks the opposite and let's all get in a room together here and argue it out and see who has the better data, or we need more data, because it's all so new. The idea is is it social media in general? That's too broad. Is it screen time? That's still too broad. Is it Facebook versus TikTok versus Insta? Which one exactly is it? And what's the context? And that's a really hard problem to solve.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is the ideal, right? When academia is working correctly and the scientific process is working correctly, that's what happens, right? You have peer review and you have people criticizing work and offering different ideas and, trying to replicate your work. And that's the sort of, you need to sort of bring that scientific attitude into politics, where these are my ideas. Let's talk to somebody who disagrees. Where are the weaknesses in my argument? What evidence do you have that bring to bear on this particular issue? And let's see where it goes. It's sort of this collaborative effort where we're going to work together to try to come to some kind of consensus. And that's why I find Fishkin's work, so fascinating, that people were willing, when you sit down and present both sides of the issue and you have experts on both sides that you can ask questions to, for the first time, people are really, really deliberating about political issues. And when they do that, they'll change their opinions. It's just, that's not what our political system looks like right now. That's not how it's set up. And we don't have those conversations. And that's what we need. And that is why I'm optimistic when I look at research like that. And you do have people changing. And it's not, again, just coming to the middle. It's like conservatives taking really more liberal positions and liberals taking really more conservative positions because they're convinced by better arguments. It can happen. You just have to have that right context in which people feel as though they can learn both sides of the issue, they can deliberate these things, and they can change their mind, that it's okay to change their mind. And if we ever get to that point, places like Fox News, it'll be a losing business proposition. It's a bad business plan because people won't want that kind of news anymore. They'll want both points of view and they'll want that sort of cross-party discussion. We just need to get people to want to be there.
Well, originally Hannity was Hannity and Holmes. Remember,
right,
he was always debating the liberal, and I always loved that firing line. With different people, that was golden television. There's just not much of that anymore. It's more like the Saturday Night Live original bit with Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin played the combating debaters. Yeah. Jane, you ignorant slut. It's like, actually, we've become that. I mean, it was a spoof at the time. Now it's like, that's what it's like.
Yeah, that's tame. Right?
Yes, right. That's too funny, yeah. All right, Timothy. Well, I hope everybody reads your book. Everybody in Congress should get this book and read it and go, oh, maybe I should rethink what I'm doing here. Well, I don't know.
Thank you so much, Michael. I greatly appreciate it.
By the way, are you off of social media too, as well as cable TV?
I do have a Twitter account, and people could follow me at TJ Redmo, TJREDMO. But honestly, I basically use it as like a cloud. If I find articles I think are interesting that I might bring into class, it's just I I keep it there. I used to print them up, and now I put them there. Yeah. And but I have had some some really nice interactions on Twitter, and it's sort of what you make of it. But I've had a lot of really good conversations with people from time to time, and I love it for being exposed to new research that's coming out and that people are sharing. So I'm not with any kind of technology. I'm not a Luddite about this stuff. I think it is what you make of it. I think it's wonderful. Like when think about when we were talking about reverse image searching. If you came upon a image and you didn't know if it was fake, there was nothing you could really do. Now, within seconds, you could check to see if it's real or not. When you come across a poll, you can click on a link, you could go to that poll, you could scroll down, you can find the exact questions that they were asking. Were the way that they phrased the question biased, is the order of the questions biased? Like, you never could do that if you were just reading a poll in the newspaper. So the internet gives us such a wonderful opportunity to sort of practice our critical thinking skills. And so I love it. But there are a lot of negative consequences. I just hope we could sort of fix the bad stuff and keep the good stuff.
Regulate it. Just control yourself. I mean, people go, I have to get off Twitter. I have to quit social media. What? You don't have to quit. Just, it's like you can have 1 or 2 drinks of glass of wine with dinner. You don't have to drink 2 bottles. Just regulate.
Exactly. And the thing is, like, Chris Bale, I don't know if you've ever had him on the show. He'd be great to be on, but he's at Duke University and he wrote a book, like escaping the social media prism or breaking the social media prism, something like that. And he, one of his major takeaways from his research, he actually found, and this would be important. I'm sorry if I'm going on here, but
no, it's all right. It's good.
He said, because a lot of times you'll read that, well, sort of to break down this polarization and partisanship, we just need these cross-party talks, and you need to expose yourself to differing points of view. But what often isn't told is you have to be really careful at how you do that, because if you expose yourself to real radical voices on the other side, if you're a liberal and start watching Fox News, you're not going to become more moderate. You're just going to become more angry. And what he found, they were doing stuff on Twitter, and they basically paid people like Democrats to follow some Republicans, and some Republicans to follow some Democrats. But it was like people like, Republicans had to follow Nancy Pelosi and stuff like that. They were the party leaders. And actually people became more polarized and more extreme. And so one takeaway from his research is that you have to be really careful of the people that you're associating with. Like I'm careful to cultivate friendships and, people who think differently on a lot of issues than I do. And it's wonderful because I know them and we're friends, and, so it doesn't, and I know they're not really extreme. And so you just have to really cultivate those conversations carefully. But the other thing that, the conclusion that he drew was that the last thing people should do is get off social media, because the people who are more likely to do that are the more sort of moderate voices, or, the more critically thinking kind of people. And he says that those people need to speak up. And it's not easy, because he shares like these heartbreaking stories in his book about people who were more moderate and they tried to chime in on conversations, and then it just like escalated where people are like, I hope you die. Right. And so like, why would you put up with that? Right. And that's the reaction that a lot of people are having is, I don't know if this person's crazy. They're going to find out where I live and they're going to come hurt my family. And so people don't want to engage. But the more like people moderate, or, just even if you are more liberal conservative, but you're willing to listen to the other side, the more those people pull out, the more it's left for extremists. And then it makes it seem like everybody is this extreme, and it leads to that false polarization and, all that stuff that we were talking about. So, I would encourage people not to leave, to stay on it and to engage more, because it creates that norm, right? The more you see people sort of taking these moderate positions, then you don't feel like you're alone. And then other people will feel more comfortable coming out and doing that as well. And that could sort of tip the scale, tip the balance of what we think our community is like.
Yeah. I do think it'll sort itself out, and there'll be new technologies to sort through and fact check things like the reverse image thing you mentioned. When the printing press was first invented, there was much hand wringing about what this is going to do to society and culture. And it's like, well, yeah, but we get Shakespeare. Yeah, but you get Mein Kampf. Yeah, but we get Shakespeare. It's like, it's not going away for sure. And I suppose the economic incentives of these companies to keep people on their platforms by ramping up emotionally negative content is problematic. But what are you going to do? That's how it evolved as a market.
Yeah, I think, but it comes back to the idea of self-government, and if we can start to demand that sort of thing. So if there is a new platform that emerges that is more sort of let's have these reasonable conversations, and people want to go there and do that, and it becomes popular, then some of these more extreme things, it'll just become cesspools of extremists, and there won't be much going on there. But we have to sort of demand that stuff, and we have to ask for news programs like Crossfire used to be, with different points of view, and to make those more partisan sites be a losing business proposition. That a lot of that comes down to us and what we demand and ask, and politicians would then respond to that. If we wouldn't put up with some of the stuff and hold people accountable for some of the things that they do, didn't vote them into office, didn't reelect them because we thought that they were just sort of partisan hacks who weren't really there with the national interest in mind, then that would become a losing proposition too, and people would change how they campaign. But it ultimately comes down, there are structural changes that could take place for sure, but what do I have control over? It's me and how I respond to this stuff.
I've gotten really good at reading articles online that are broken up with all those ads, of not even looking at the ads. I'm just able to track the sentence. And I'm just scrolling in a way like, don't look. I don't even want them to tempt my eye to go over there. And it's painful to if you just kind of take in the whole page. It's like, this is the ugliest thing.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, does anybody? It must pay, because otherwise they wouldn't do it, because it's horrible. There was a UFO study that was published, and I came across my Twitter feed, and I thought, this is one of my areas. I got to click on this. And the study was conducted by some eye vision company. And I'm like, what's this got to do with anything? So I wrote the person, and they go, oh, well, we just did this to try to get eyeballs to our business.
Oh, you're kidding.
So of course I didn't trust the data, because it's like, it's probably an N of 100 or something,
Wow.
it's like that's a stretch.
Wow. That is something.
Yeah. Then there's all the kind of come-ons, like these are the top 10 books of last year. It's like, oh, I'm an author, I want to check this out. It has nothing to do with some survey on what people are reading. It's just like some site with a bunch of ads.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of, in clickbait headlines are, getting worse and worse. You read it and you click on it and you start reading the article, you're like, this isn't really what the headline talked about at all.
Right. Or, another one was the craziest pictures from the late 19th century of how people lived. You won't believe picture number 19, So the first time I'm like, oh my God, I get to get to number 19. I'm like, oh, this is all bullshit. Yeah, it's crazy. All right, Tim, it's great to talk to you.
It was great talking to you too.